Hello everyone, it's Robert McDermott again, this time talking about Plato, though I did take a talk on Plato earlier, a week or two ago. Since then, while preparing for Aristotle, I had some more thoughts. I said, I should have said this, I should have said that. Perhaps some of the thoughts that I will say today are repetitive of what I said a week or two ago, but I just want to build up Plato a little bit in all of his confident brilliance on the way to Aristotle, who begins as a student of Plato, not just Plato's thought, but actually of Plato himself, and then slowly shrinks or lowers the upper story in a way that is more sensible, more practical, more accessible, and that's one of the great choices that we have. How far do we want to go with Plato? And if not all the way being the divided line, and then the theory of forms, the philosopher king, the allegory of the cave, all in the middle books of the Republic. We don't want to go that far. How far can we go, or should we go? Or should we finish where the later Aristotle finishes with the forms and the good, the ultimate purpose of life is not so ambitious as Plato's, not so lending toward the idea of two levels, but where the two levels are really brought together. It's not totally flat. It's not like a 20th century humanist, naturalist for whom there's only the human, or the earth and human, but nothing like the Chinese Tao, or Plato's The Good, or reason, as there was for the Stoics, reason and nature being some law of the cosmos which guides human beings whether they know it or not. So we all have this invitation, beginning with Socrates, to enter the philosophic life, to begin to think and think and keep thinking until we get some idea of what we want to, what kind of ideas, worldview, perspectives we want to guide our life, and then to keep thinking and to make the revisions, either because we're going from young adulthood to middle adulthood to older adulthood, maybe to old age. It's never okay to stop improving your philosophy, because the philosophy determines your action. At least the Greeks were convinced that it did. Now that we've read Freud, maybe we're not so sure about the relationship between thinking and behavior, because ever since Freud, we have to be conscious that our thinking might not be so what shall we say, believable, because we lie to ourselves and we cover up and we are unconscious of our motives. So thinking really comes into a very questionable situation once we get to Freud and to 20th century psychology. So Socrates, Plato, Aristotle did not have that concern. They were convinced that thinking will lead to action. And surely there's some truth to it. Freud didn't destroy that completely. He just let us know that we should be more careful and introspective about whether we really have right to think that the reasons we give are really the reasons governing our action, or whether there are some other reasons, inaccessible, in fact, pushed down deliberately to be inaccessible, so that we feel freer and better to do what we really want to do, even though we're lying about the reasons. All that's very complicated and not at all Socratic or Platonic or Aristotelian. They have the view that what we think leads directly to our action. And there's enough truth to that, I think, that we can proceed trying to get the best thoughts, the best ideas in our mind, though we may revise them, nevertheless, we have to start. So we started with Socrates in search of a guide of action, a guide of morality. He calls, in some translations, it's called piety. Something that would stand still, that would be objective. He wasn't so much concerned about all people, he was concerned about all Athenians, which for him was pretty much all people. And so he was trying to get there, and at the end of his life, he said he was still searching, and that at least, but he did know what was just with respect to his being a citizen of Athens. Then we come to Plato, who was a young man when Socrates was executed, and his early dialogues were Socratic in the sense that they were about Socrates' teachings, and they didn't go much beyond what Socrates would have said had he been writing those dialogues. But then we go to a book such as The Republic, which I take to be at the center, the peak really of Plato's confident philosophizing, and there Plato answers the question, what is the good, or what is the objective end of human life, what is the ground, the foundation of virtue. And he says it is the good, and the good is ultimate transcendent reality, which is knowable by someone who lives the philosophic life, who spends a life searching the up and up from ordinary fleeting perceptions and fleeting thoughts to enduring thoughts, to criteria that can help organize and illumine our actions or the actions of those around us, and then to abstract concepts like love, beauty, justice, and then the good, which holds those three and is the source of those three. So we build up from ordinary events, ordinary moments, to these ultimate, infinite and eternal realities, and then we see that once we get there, we trace them down into the ordinary, the practical, and the fleeting. So that it's very hierarchical, and the best is at the top, and the least valuable is at the bottom. Okay, now one of the exciting processes or struggles that Plato had was, how does he get those philosophic ideas to organize a state which could then be just, instead of a state that was controlled by rich people trying to get more riches, and who would put to death anybody who questioned them, which is of course what happened with his teacher Socrates. So he says, well, in order for this to work, we would need to have the philosopher, the person who spends his or her life, and he did mean his, though he did have the equality of men and women, he's clearly picturing a male as being probably more likely to be successful in classical civilization, particularly in Athens. So the philosopher king would be someone who studied his whole life, inquired, entered into dialectic, the back and forth of answers, questions, answers, questions, answers, until that person would get a knowledge, would get insight concerning the ultimate structure of the world, and would have reliable knowledge about human affairs, human behavior. If that person who did that who lived that philosophic life, were to get power, or to be not just a philosopher but a king, it's possible that that person, with the knowledge that he had, could organize the guardians, the people who are actually running the society, and they could partake in the philosophic wisdom that the philosopher king embodies, and they would then bring about the harmony of the parts of the state and the harmony of each individual in the state. So he divides the state and the individual into three parts: the philosophic, the rational, the thinking part, and then the more spirited part, which we might call the feeling part, And then the third part is the appetitive and the basically the life of a laborer, a person who has very important but limited aspirations. Basically, that person is paying attention to work and to food and sex, and it's a completely physical life. And Plato says there are such people, and that's really what they want. And they're born with that nature. So he has these kind of metals, gold and silver and bronze as different kinds of persons. And he wants all these three types to be happy, to be in the state in a way that the state is just and they have a just, harmonious relationship between those parts. Now, last time we talked a little bit about the cave. That would be the story which tells what would happen if somebody claimed to have this knowledge which could then basically construct and sustain the justice of the state. And you recall Plato says the person would go out, and of course he's thinking of Socrates, and he would go out and look at the sun and say, whoa, that's the real thing. That's not shadows on a wall, that's reality. And that's transcendent, and it's right there. It's always there, and we should see that as the reality and not a lot of shadows behind bodies, and the shadows on the wall of the cave. And then Plato has this person go back in and try to tell the people in the cave what they're missing, and it's all different. It's totally different. You're living in a world of shadows when you should be living in a world of reality. And then the answer comes if that person, let's say Socrates, tried to tell those people what they were missing and what the real reality that Plato thinks he has found, they would kill him. So now Plato then is the one who, with pure philosophic capacity and dedication, not with a revelation, not with the Hebrew scriptures, not with the Christian scriptures, which of course come after anyway, but not any kind of dogmatic religious revelation, but purely on the strength of his dedicated thinking, comes to this world of transcendent forms or ideas, realities that ray down onto all particulars. And when that comes into Christianity, beginning with John's Gospel, who talks about the Logos, and then particularly in Augustine, who is schooled in Neoplatonic philosophy mostly from Plotinus, which comes 6 centuries after Plato, but it's very thoroughly Platonic. The Augustine and other fathers of the church then speak about these ideal forms, ideas, transcendent values as being in the mind of God, and that shaped the whole of creation, but particularly the human nature, which is a seed, a spark, a fragment of God's own nature, which of course includes, which is the good, and includes the values included in the good: love, truth, beauty, and in more than justice. It's really love replaces justice as a divine quality, whereas justice is right and correct. Love is even more than right and correct. It goes the extra, and in the sense of giving to another what is more than just, but comes out of benevolence or a desire to help another the way one would help oneself. Okay, so Plato finishes the Republic saying it is possible to have a philosopher king who would combine knowledge and power in a way that could then structure the society in sort of the justice, which is harmony for all of the individuals. And of course, then he would have to have control of the educational system. So you could say that the Republic is actually a philosophy of education. It's a paideia. It is a treatment of the ideals of society, ideals of the just society, or ideals of the ideal society. Great word, paideia. P-A-I-D-E-I-A. And so that's the sort of the ultimate philosophic claim or vision. And Plato, at the end of his life, writes what's called the, I guess what it is, he didn't call it, but someone else, scholars call the seventh letter. Originally they weren't so sure it was Plato's, that it was decided that it was. And in that letter, Plato says that after a lifetime of thinking, a person could reach a kind of a flaming insight, could reach some kind of intuition, that the reality would kind of rise up and present itself to a person who is seeking, not to a person who is not seeking, but rather to a person who is looking and training the mind and controlling the senses, has a kind of a meditative intellect that can receive not the revelation in a religion, but a revelation nevertheless, and maybe a revelation that has many of the same qualities as get incorporated into a religion. So you see, it's a short step from Plato's, the middle of Plato's Republic to the early centuries of Christianity. Not so much, well, the Judaism and Christianity have a lot in common when in the Middle Ages, but actually Islam first, and then Christianity, when they're both trying to compare and reconcile really their scriptures. Maimonides is doing the Hebrew scripture, and the Avicenna of Averroes is doing the Quran, and Thomas Aquinas is reconciling the New Testament, all with Aristotle, who now becomes not a replacement for Plato, but a revision, a refinement, a different philosophic mentality, a mentality which is more willing to invest in the immediate, particular, and particularly in diversity, in the variety of possible answers and possible qualities that are to be prized. So Thomas Aquinas doesn't stop being a Platonist. He still has the ideals that are from God, and that they are governing of human life, but he's much more impressed than Plato or Plotinus or Augustine with the close relationship between the ideal form, the divine, and the human. So he's not, he's a Catholic, he's not a Protestant. He doesn't have this strong sense of the fall that you find in Augustine. It's a very healthy-minded Christianity. So, but to enjoy all that, and it is enjoyable to think about him trying to reconcile Plato and Aristotle and the New Testament, you need to know about Aristotle. And that is the next lecture, when we talk about the general character of Aristotle's thought, and then get ready to discuss the ethics, Nicomachean ethics, which is Aristotle's revision of Platonic ethics. So the good comes into human life, even into ordinary life, but you'll see there's still a remnant of Plato. So that's next time, Aristotle.